Greetings, this is Tom with Buncombe Shinola. Today we're going to be discussing Paul McCartney's House of Horror and Misery. Admittedly, once I concocted that title, I was kicking myself for not having completed this video before Halloween, but at least I'm almost getting it done in time for the new, unquote, Beatles single. But I want to talk about this intriguing web of factoids. As a fan of the Beatles, of course, and vintage horror cinema, a bunch of these bits of information were floating around my head, but then suddenly I realized the satisfying way in which they were all connected, and I thought it would be interesting to make a video where I weave this web of extremely obscure rock and roll and exploitation movie folklore. So for the cover of the Wings album, Band on the Run, McCartney had just lost a significant portion of his band previous to recording the album, and he decided for the cover that he would gather a group of celebrities to pose as outlaw musicians for the cover photo. A bunch of these celebrities are extremely England, UK-centric. Some of these people would probably not be very well known outside of Great Britain. The exception originally for a long time, the most famous person on this album cover was one of the Americans, James Coburn, who had appeared in many war movies and many westerns, and he was in the really bad James Bond imitation Flint movies. But over time, it's been borne out that the most famous person on this album cover is Christopher Lee. Like his good friend Peter Cushing, with whom he made several movies together in the 50s and 60s. Later in his life, Christopher Lee appeared in basically some of the most popular, famous movies ever. Christopher Lee appeared throughout the Lord of the Rings series, much like Peter Cushing scored a really solid role for the original Star Wars films. But at the time, you'd be well excused to presume that there was some sort of Roger Moore-era James Bond link between McCartney and Christopher Lee. Paul McCartney, of course, had written the theme music to Live and Let Die, but actually Christopher Lee had not yet starred in his James Bond movie. He would appear in The Man with the Golden Gun later on. No, Christopher Lee had first crossed paths with the Beatles when they were filming A Hard Day's Night. I've done some research and I have not been able to pinpoint exactly which movie Christopher Lee was working on when he crossed paths with the Beatles at this point. It was either The Gorgon, there was a couple other movies he was making around the same time. Paul McCartney said something about a Dracula movie or some such, but the only vampire movie he was making was not in England. I'm pretty sure it's The Gorgon. But anyway, he met them at that point, and later on, they maintained a friendship, and he eventually ended up on the album cover. I'm sure there are people that are aware of Christopher Lee's heavy metal album, which he recorded shortly before he died, but I'm not sure everyone is aware that he was an extremely capable song and dance man. He had a long time offer to record material with David Bowie, but they just never found the right time or the right project. Christopher Lee also appeared in several semi-musical films, and if you have not seen the video of him on YouTube singing the song Pick Your Poison, you need to check that out as soon as you're done watching this. It is just amazing. Not too long after he befriended the Beatles, Christopher Lee appeared in Not a Hammer, an Amicus production called Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, once again appearing alongside his friend Peter Cushing. This is just the sort of earnest but schlocky vintage horror film that I love. This is an anthology film, that is to say it's 4 or 5 short stories, kind of like Creepshow. Interestingly, Christopher Lee portrays a snobbish art critic who, after causing a painter he has criticized to lose his hands, is haunted as severed appendages, crawl around. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen a movie like this before, but this is the 60s version of the trope. In one of the other stories in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, a sort of jazz lounge musician visits some tropical island and witnesses, I don't know, some kind of tribal voodoo ceremony. Supposedly he steals some of the music to write a hit, and he brings it back to civilization and presents it to the band. And as a quick aside here, I just wanted to note that there is a surprising amount of exploitative 45 releases of music connected to this film, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. Well worth looking up, or perhaps I'll concoct a playlist for you guys. Just really bizarre 45 sleeves and titles, and the music's all nuts. Check it out. So back at the nightclub, one of his other fellow musicians warns him that it would be unwise to use the music he's stolen. And after it becomes somewhat popular, he's haunted by, well, if not, members of the tribe, spiritual protectors of their tribe. The actor portraying this warning musician is named Kenny Lynch. Now, Kenny Lynch is interesting. He goes back a little bit further. He was an early prominent English black musician. And in the very early 60s, on tour with a female artist named Helen Shapiro, he befriended an up-and-coming band called the Beatles. So the story goes, he overheard them working on a song called From Me to You and actually chided them for their musical inability and their extremely poor grasp of, the art of songwriting. At the same time, the Beatles were attempting to concoct a track that they hoped Helen Shapiro, the tour headliner, might record, a song called Misery. And while Kenny seemed disapproving of their abilities, once the tour was done, he did actually record his own version of this Lennon-McCartney song, Misery, which indeed became the first cover version of a Beatles song released by another artist. Now, this song is somewhat less familiar to American audiences because it is one of the two songs that appear on the debut LP in England, but the various versions of that record that appeared in America, be they on the VJ label or the early Beatles of Capitol, sometimes the songs There's a Place and Misery do not appear, so it's somewhat more obscure for an early Beatles song. But indeed, here he was. More than a footnote of history, he is one of the first people that, stuck his neck out to say these guys are going to be something, and he was right. Over the years, obviously, very slowly over time, Christopher Lee's star rose, and Kenny Lynch continued to build a career as a variety performer, continued writing and producing music, even some fascinating forays into exploitation soundtrack music, later on with Assault on Precinct 13 and the Emmanuel franchise. To bring this all around, one of the other faces on the Paul McCartney Band on the Run Wings LP cover that you may not recognize is Kenny Lynch, hanging out there, right there, beside his old filmmate, Christopher Lee, and his old musical compadre, Paul McCartney. So there you have it, Paul McCartney, via his LP cover art, bringing together the humblest beginnings of the British invasion into the 60s era of worldwide explosive popularity, and unknowingly into the modern-day permanence of English influence upon our collective culture. Hey, this is Tom with Buncombe Shinola. I appreciate you all watching the video. Feel free to check out my recent reaction video to every Beatles song ranked and rated. And I will put a link up on the screen if you'd like to check out my other clips of pop culture blatherings. Thanks. Talk to you soon.